And now to Sri Lanka. Despite the widening economic and political crisis in Sri Lanka, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa said he's not resigning from office. His declaration defies calls from his public and political opponents for his resignation in the heated circumstance. There have been widespread protests running for weeks over lengthy power cuts and shortages of gas, food and other basic goods in the country. The public anger has prompted nearly all cabinet ministers to quit and scores of members of parliament to leave his government. Opposition members of parliament have also rejected his invite to form a national unity government, saying voters want the president and entire government to resign. Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis since gaining independence from the UK in 1948. Protests across the country continued on Wednesday, and public frustration over the crisis has seen peaceful demonstrations held since January. And joining me virtually now from Washington to discuss the Sri Lanka crisis is a global affairs analyst, Calvin Dak. Good to have you join us.
Here.
So this is just, it has spiraled out of control, something that started with the government cutting down on tax, and then, tried to print money to make up for that tax cut, and then became an economic crisis, also now a political turmoil. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that there are definitely several layers. I think it's interesting to note that from the U.S. coverage and even from the U.S. State Department, this is being very carefully described as an economic crisis and not, say, a crisis of political or democratic, although that seems to be what is resulting from it. I think the irony for me is that because the protests are responding to the very dire economic situation, the protests, which are part of democracy, are actually increasing instability, which then makes it less likely that Sri Lanka can get the international financial assistance it may need from the IMF and others to solve the problem that the people are protesting about in the first place. So I think that that's one of the more interesting parts of it, and it'll be interesting to see how it pans out.
But do you think that more money needs to be thrown at this problem? Is this not a policy crisis? Because Sri Lanka has received already 16 IMF loans and nothing. I mean, the country is still in an economic crisis. Do you think that more money should be thrown at this crisis?
I think it's a possibility, and here's why. I think that the economic crisis is due to two reasons. One is something that every country in the world has had to deal with, and that's the economic negative consequences of the COVID pandemic. And like I said, that happened here in the U.S., happened in virtually every other country. And in the U.S., we threw money at it. In fact, the Congress just this week threw even more money at it, and that's necessary. But the second cause that we're seeing in Sri Lanka is bad management and bad leadership. And that's the kind of problem that you don't want to throw more money at, because if there's bad leadership in the past with money, more money isn't going to make that better. So I think there's got to be a mix of addressing the post-pandemic economic crisis while also changing the leadership, or not necessarily changing leadership, but changing the way the leaders are managing the country so that they can get out of this economic hole.
And we've seen calls for President Rajapaksa to resign. His chief government whip has said that that's not going to happen. He's not going to resign. Members of parliament have left, 41 members of parliament have left the coalition, making his party the minority in parliament. We've also seen his cabinet, all members of his cabinet resign. Do you think that there's a way he survives this crisis, because he has said he's not going to resign?
I don't think the mere fact that he said he's not going to resign is going to really have an effect, because we've seen all around the world that just because the leader says they're going to stay in power doesn't necessarily mean they will, but they can. I think one of the main factors as we think about the president is his family. because part of what a lot of people are protesting is the family that has, amassed wealth, amassed power. Especially before the last month, several very close members of the president were in high positions of power. And so I think that perception of corruption or gaining wealth while the rest of the country is suffering, that's an image problem that's going to be really hard for the president to kind of shake off. So I think the more we see lack of support from his own party and less cooperation from the opposition, the less that statement about him not leaving power is going to mean.
And how much worse do you think that this crisis will get? We've seen that because there is lack of foreign exchange or depleting foreign exchange or foreign currency rather in Sri Lanka, the country is not able to import fuel, food, and other necessities. We also hear that hospitals are on the verge of closing. How much worse do you think that this crisis will get?
I think it has the potential to get a lot worse, but what I also think is that these effects of this crisis are really affecting everyday lives of Sri Lankans. And that frustration is only going to last but so long. And so I think that the increased pressure from the Sri Lankan people will force the government to change management and maybe even change leadership. I also think another factor that we need to think about are the allies and semi-allies, as I like to say, in the region that may step in to help Sri Lanka. That'll be interesting because we'll have to see what strings are attached to any of that help. And I know from the U.S. perspective, as we want to continue to have good relationships with Sri Lanka as an example of democracy in the region, that's going to affect what we do in the U.S. as to who exactly they look to for help to get out of this economic crisis.
And Sri Lanka seems to be relying at the moment on aid from China. Not China, India. Seems to be finding that leadership path with India and not China, even though a lot of the debt burden on Sri Lanka right now came from China's Belt and Road Initiative project. Sri Lanka did ask China to restructure, or the president asked China to restructure some of those loans, but nothing has happened yet. Should China show some sort of leadership in terms of helping restructure some of those loans that Sri Lanka owes to China?
Well, I think that's a two-part question. Should they? Yes, they should try to help in any way they can to relax the conditions to help Sri Lanka get out of this crisis. But the second part is, will they? That will all depend on how it helps China, how it helps their ambitions in the region, how it helps their view of hegemony in the region, and especially dealing with the United States. So that remains to be seen. But, China's doing what any other country would do, that they're balancing, obviously helping a country that's in turmoil with how that affects their long-term regional and international goals.
So Calvin Dak, I'm going to put you on hold as we take a break. We also know that not just Sri Lanka, but Pakistan, Sri Lanka's neighbor, is also having crisis. We'll talk about that when we return. Stay with us.
Thank you.
There are certain moments in the day when I need my me time to just unwind and indulge.
Now available in 30 grams and 450 grams.
Sometimes before I step on stage, my mind gets clouded. But that's when I know it's time to take that deep, tum-tum cooling breath.
Thanks for staying with us. We have Calvin Dak, Global Affairs Analyst. We were talking earlier about the economic crisis and political turmoil in Sri Lanka. Thank you for staying with us, Calvin Dak. But just before that break, I did mention that Pakistan is also experiencing some sort of political turmoil. And both Pakistan and Sri Lanka are neighbors. And let me ask you, because when you look at both leaders, President Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Imran Khan, both of them were promising leaders who came in with majority support, promising to fight corruption, deal with the economic crisis in these countries. But it doesn't look like nothing has changed. In fact, things have gotten worse. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that the adage of, you elect a leader for what could happen, not what you think is going to happen. Both of these leaders, as in every country in the world, has faced external factors like the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic fallout. I do think it is important that they did come in with such support, and even though support is waning, that they still have it. The thing is going to be is, as they think about how to get their countries out of these crises, one, will it work? But maybe even more importantly, in the short term, do they have the confidence? Does it exude the confidence that the people that did put them in office with those very strong numbers, that they believe they can get them out of the crisis?
And do you think they will get out of this crisis? President Rajapaksa is facing calls for resignation, while Prime Minister Imran Khan is also facing a no confidence vote in Parliament, although that is now a subject of litigation at the Supreme Court.
Well, yeah, I think both of them are trying to stay in power, but like I said, I think that particularly with with Sri Lanka, less so in Pakistan, as the pressure continues to build with the people in the protest, that's what the leaders, the president, and those remaining in power are going to have to think about. But I think an important thing to think about whether it's Sri Lanka or Pakistan, is as we look at the region, what are the regional powers? What are they going to do to respond? And that's not only China, but of course the U.S. And we know that the Ukraine situation factors this in as well, because how they are responding to the international effort in Ukraine is affecting their relationship with other allies. And so that also will play a factor in this.
And do you think that this puts some sort of leadership burden on India to step in and see what it can do in terms of this crisis in both countries?
Yes, because it is obviously in India's best interest to have a stable region, and it also helps with India to kind of balance other powers in the region. Now, I think it will be interesting with India to see how India and the U.S. work together to resolve the issue in Sri Lanka, or at least to address it. Because I think that's what the U.S. is looking to do, because the U.S. is not looking to get involved in conflicts around the world any more than they have to, as we're seeing in the Ukraine and we've seen in other areas. So India could come out to be a very pivotal player to represent the West and the United States' interest in this conflict.
And how much influence do you think India has in that region?
I think it has a lot, but the how much is going to depend on the financial assistance, because let's remember that at least in Sri Lanka's case, this is an economic crisis. So however any country with the means can help Sri Lanka come out of this economic crisis, that's gonna be the country that has influence. But like I said before, we've got to look and see what strings are attached to any help that Sri Lanka gets from any of the regional partners or even the U.S.
All right, we'll see how things play out in that region. Thank you so much for talking to us, Calvin Dark, Global Affairs Analyst.
Thank you.